Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Jill O'Donnell. I am the director of the Yider Institute here at the University of Nebraska-Lincoln. Thank you for joining us today. Today's webinar on U.S. trade negotiations is the fourth in our series on the theme of measuring and managing risk and uncertainty in international trade. There will be two more webinars following this one between now and October 9th. All session details, including video recordings of our previous sessions, are available on our website. I'd like to thank the Chicago Mercantile Exchange Group Foundation, or CME Group Foundation, for its support of this webinar series, which the Yider Institute hosts every other year in honor of Clayton Yider, who served as president and CEO of the CME from 1978 to 1985. Before we start, I'd like to highlight a few people in the audience to give everyone a sense of who is joining us today, even though you can't see their faces. So welcome to Melissa Kessler with the U.S. Grains Council, Alice Calder with Trade Vistas, and Ronald Drozd, a professor at Temple University who is also a University of Nebraska-Lincoln alumnus. Welcome to them and to all of you. As a reminder to all attendees, your audio is muted and your video is off, but we are eager to engage you with your questions. Please use the Q&A function in Zoom to submit your questions for our speakers. This webinar is being recorded and will be posted to our website afterwards. And now I'm pleased to introduce our speakers. Wendy Cutler is the Vice President of the Asia Society Policy Institute and also serves as the Managing Director of its Washington, D.C. office. Previously, she served for nearly 33 decades as a diplomat and chief negotiator of the Trans-Pacific Partnership in the Office of the U.S. Trade Representative. Clete Willems is a partner at Aiken Gump Strauss Hauer and Feld, where he advises multinational companies, investors, and trade associations on international economic law and policy matters. Until April 2019, he was Deputy Assistant to the President for International Economics and Deputy Director of the National Economic Council, where he was a key negotiator with foreign governments, including China and the European Union, as well as the President's lead negotiator at the G7, G20, and Asia Pacific Economic Cooperation Forum. And our moderator today is Ken Levinson, the Executive Director of the Washington International Trade Association. He is also a member of the Yider Institute Advisory Council. Previously, he worked in roles advising companies on international trade and tax policy and also worked on these issues in the U.S. Senate. With that, I will turn it over to Ken.
Thank you, Jill, and thank you to the Yider Institute for inviting all of us here today. It's a real honor to be associated with anything having to do with Clayton Yider. Ambassador Yider was a great friend of many of us in the trade community, and I'm honored to be part of this series and on the advisory council for the Institute. Really delighted too as well to be here with two good friends, Clete Willems and Wendy Cutler, two stalwarts of the Washington trade community and well-known names to many people around the world who work on international trade and have worked with the United States over the recent years. Also frequent guests on our WIDA platform and glad to be able to join them here today with all of you. Wish we could be with you in person. I had the opportunity to be in Lincoln with the Yider Institute last fall and was hoping to be back again this year. But really glad to be here today virtually with Clete and Wendy, coming to you from Washington, D.C. myself. And thank you all for joining us. So we're going to hear to talk about some of the new approaches on trade that the Trump administration has been pursuing in recent years. Clete recently left the Trump administration about a year ago, Clete, 2 years now?
That's right.
Yeah. And
Seems
Wendy,
like a long time ago, but only a year since I left.
And Wendy, who was left towards the end of the Obama administration, left her role as one of the United States' leading trade negotiators. So, you know, the topic for today is really to look at sort of the direction that trade negotiations have gone under President Trump and where it may be leading us towards in the future. And thought we'd kick things off, Wendy, with you to maybe give us a little bit of an overview of what we're talking about here, whether, you know, comprehensive trade negotiations and agreements like you got to negotiate with the Trans-Pacific Partnership, which we can get into a little bit more later, and then this trend towards more mini deals, less comprehensive agreements, these bilateral agreements, but there's also multilateral agreements and plurilateral agreements and bilateral agreements. And all of these are things that I know you've been involved with at various times, and same with you, Clete. Talk about sort of the different types of trade agreements we have to kind of set the table a little bit for the rest of the discussion.
Well, thanks, Ken. I'd be glad to do that. And first, it's just a real honor to be on this panel with Ken and Clete. But I also just want to let the listeners know that I worked for 9 USTRs during my tenure at the Office of the U.S. Trade Representative. And the first USTR I worked for was Clayton Yiter. And it was a real pleasure and honor to work for him. It wasn't for very long. He then quickly moved on to become Secretary of Agriculture. But even once he left the US government, he remained very involved in trade policy and was a great mentor and friend during the, the following years. I recall when we hosted APEC in 2011, Ambassador Yiter coming in and making a pitch for us holding one of the meetings in Omaha, Nebraska, trying to explain to us why it was really still, even though it was in the heartland of the United States, it was still close to the Pacific Ocean. But in any event, it's a real honor to be here. And Jill, you're putting together an amazing program. So now I'm going to get to the question that Ken asked, and I'm going to try and be as brief as possible so we can have a conversation. But in setting the stage on the types of trade agreements that can be negotiated, I kind of think of it really kind of 3 buckets, and there's some overlap between each of them. The first bucket really refers to the number of partners at the negotiating table with you. And here there are basically 3 alternatives. First, you can have a multilateral negotiation. And in trade speak, that really means doing a WTO negotiation with the full membership. The second type of agreement would be a plurilateral negotiation, which is really a subset of all of the trading partners. This could be done on a regional basis, on an issue-specific basis, but and it can range really from anywhere between I think there are 80 countries now in a plurilateral in the WTO negotiating e-commerce versus TPP, where there were 12 countries. And after we left, there were 11 countries participating. And finally, bilateral negotiations, kind of one-on-one negotiations. And we'll get into that because that's where the Trump administration has really focused on. But in addition to looking at the number of partners, you can also look at the number of issues on the table that you're negotiating. And here, there are also kind of 3 subsets. One would be a comprehensive negotiation, and that really means you're negotiating everything from labor and the environment to tariffs to intellectual property, but a full-blown free trade area negotiation is what comes to mind. Second, you can negotiate an issue-specific specific topic. It could be a sectoral negotiation, like the information technology agreements that were negotiated, or it could be kind of a cross-cutting functional issue, which affects a lot of different sectors. And here, one area that comes to mind is an agreement I worked on with respect to counterfeit goods. And third here, there's kind of what I would call kind of like a package of unrelated issues where a number of issues are announced kind of, and this is where the term, I think, mini deal has been used a lot in this administration, where it could be a combination of some bilateral irritants, but also could include issues like good regulatory practices or digital trade, but again, a subset of issues. And finally, the third bucket is what I would call phased agreements. And here you can do an agreement in one phase, or you can have a multi-phase agreement. The idea here, and we'll get more into this, is in a multi-phase agreement, maybe you want one phase where you want to harvest the issues that you've been able to reach agreement on, and then announce that deal, and then get to the tougher issues. I would conclude by saying that having worked in all types of these negotiations, there's no one size fits all. And to have an effective trade policy, you really need to look at your objectives, the issues at hand, and decide which approach works the best for you. Thanks.
So Wendy, you dropped a bunch of phrases, and I know you maybe aren't trying to tee me up for the next question, but you talked about phases and early harvest. And Clete, this is just sort of a softball headed your way, but which we're actually, I guess Iowa was a field of dreams, not Nebraska, but, we can mix our baseball metaphors and everything here too. But early harvest, phase one deal with China. You were part of the administration that helped negotiating with China a lot over the last recent years. They announced a phase one deal earlier in 2020. It feels like a long time ago with everything that's been going on in the past 9 months, but I think it was just January that they announced that deal. Why did the Trump administration choose that approach with China to have an early harvest?
Yeah, well, first let me just say, like Wendy, I'm happy to be here. I didn't work for quite as many USTRs. I think 2.5 technically. But so I don't have quite that level of experience, but I did work for Wendy. So I learned from the best in my years. When I was, before I was at the White House, I was a non-political official at USTR when Wendy was still there. But Ken, it's a great question about China. And I mean, I think in a lot of respects, the China negotiation was interesting because it evolved twice in very significant ways. So let me talk about the two different evolutions. The first is everyone knows that when the president came into office, he had serious concerns about the US-China relationship. I would say those are actually longstanding bipartisan concerns that the president just elevated and made a bigger deal of and was willing to be more aggressive about than past administrations. But they really aren't President Trump issues. They were longstanding, long-festering issues with China. Now, the way the administration originally thought it was going to proceed was through a process called Section 301, where you identify a practice that is considered to be, unfair, and I won't go through all the statutory standards, but more or less unfair, discriminates against U.S. commerce, and you initiate a domestic proceeding to investigate that, and then if you find that it is indeed, inconsistent with the 301 statute, you can put tariffs in place to try to get the other side to change the policy. So when we started down this path, we said we're going to investigate China's policies of forced technology transfer, cyber theft, state-directed investment into sensitive technologies, and those kinds of issues. And really what happened then was we started that investigation. We proposed tariffs. The relationship at that point started to get a little bit tense. And then the president said, you're going to talk to the Chinese, tell them about all these other problems that we have. And so very quickly, what was supposed to be a negotiation about these specific issues became a comprehensive negotiation. And then the US tariff policy, instead of merely counteracting the amount of cost to the US economy as a result of forced technology transfer, became a much bigger deal. And we tried to counteract all of the different unfair practices that China was enacting. So I think that evolution is important in the sense that it wasn't originally the administration, or at least Bob Lighthizer,'s intent to fix every issue under the sun under 301. It evolved that way somewhat based on the deterioration in our relationship with China, as well as the direction that the president wanted to take. And he said, this is my shot. So then we got into a scenario where we tried to do everything with China. And we put a massive range of issues on the table. Still not everything you would do in a comprehensive bilateral free trade agreement, to use the phrases that Wendy was using. But we tried to do everything from those forced technology transfer and related issues that I talked about, to IP protection, to agriculture market access, to financial services, currency, state-owned enterprises, subsidies. And we really did get into a fairly, a fairly robust discussion with them on all of these issues. And what happened, and this was well covered by the press. I think the press did a good job of this. What happened was China, Liu He, their negotiator, indicated to Lighthizer that, he thought he could get something done on basically all these issues. We had proposed text on all these issues. And he said, I got to go back and check with the big guy. I got to check with President Xi, and I'll get back to you. And when he came back to us, they had then indicated there was a lot less that they'd be able to commit to than they indicated to us in the meeting. Now, some people will say this was bad faith on China's part. They reneged on their promises. Other people would say they were just negotiating And actually, it was just part of the give and take. Regardless, what ended up happening is the president was very upset by that. He thought we were on the doorstep of a deal. He then raised tariffs. He took an action against Huawei, and the political dynamic just completely collapsed. And then it just became a question of the doable. What could we salvage out of that agreement that would still be good for both parties, that would help dial down tensions a little bit? And that was what became phase one. Now, I want to end here, though, and I want to draw a linkage back to what Wendy said. And I think this really exemplifies the difference between the Trump administration and other administrations and their approach to all of these kinds of deals. And I think that, if you look at this in an honest, objective way, multilateral, comprehensive deals are the gold standard. That's what you want. You want all countries playing by the same set of rules. You want to cover all different topic areas so the most amount of trade can flow freely and fairly. And that is sort of the idealist position. And I think a lot of administrations have strived for that. President Trump was much more pragmatic. And he said, I don't care about what the ideal situation is. I just want to get stuff done. So if that means that I can only deal with some of the issues instead of all of them, that's what I'm going to do. And if that means that I'm going to go into a bilateral setting where we have more leverage than when we're in a multilateral setting where we're taking on a bunch of countries at once, that's what I'm going to do. And so I think what you see here is just the ultimate manifestation of a pragmatist's trade policy rather than an idealist one that has some benefits in that you can maybe get more done, but it has some major downsides as well, in that maybe you don't get the big stuff done with the broader group of countries.
But let me, if I may, and if I could just drill down just a little bit, Clete. The phase one deal has a lot of purchase commitments, and but there were some big issues on the table related to forced technology transfer and the theft of IP. I remember talking to some people in the business community, and they weren't all too pleased with the tit for tat tariffs, and many of which are still in place. But they said, well, now that we've gone down this road, we better win. Did we win? Did we get the structural changes that we're looking for from China in this phase one deal, or is it really just a commitment to buy some more products from the United States at this point?
Well, I'll take the neither answer.
Okay.
And look, let me make a couple comments on that. Did we get what we hoped to? Absolutely not. And I will tell you, as a negotiator, there was a better deal on the table in April 2019. And the fact that it broke down 2 weeks after I left the White House, just a coincidence. But no, it was just happenstance. And I literally, I just want to tell the story quickly because it's sort of how it works in the real world.
We'll get to you in a sec, Wendy.
Yeah, I promised my wife I would leave the White House after our second child was born. She was born at the end of March 2019. But there was a day when I thought we were going to get the deal. And I said, Lisa, please, can I have 6 more weeks? I want to be there for the signing. And luckily she said, hell no, because, things broke down and then we didn't have the signing for another year. But that's how close we thought we were at that point. And it would have been more comprehensive. It wouldn't have solved all the problems, but it was a better text on forced technology transfer, on services, on a whole range of different things. But I do want to, one last point on this. The purchases get all the attention. We really didn't spend that much time on it. I remember one trip to Beijing. We were there for 3 days. We spent 2 days and 23 hours on the structural issues. And there are some real provisions in there on IP and on agricultural market access, which Nebraskans will care about. And literally at the end, Lighthizer says, crap, we better go talk about the purchases for a little while so I can tell the president that we didn't forget about it. And that is how it was treated by the negotiators. We saw the purchases as if they actually changed their underlying measures and they took away their barriers to market access, then the purchases would flow from that in the natural course. And so, again, my answer is neither. Did we get something of value? Absolutely. Did we get all we hoped to? Absolutely not. And I think that, to Wendy's point earlier, the only way we're ever going to solve this China problem is going to be a combination. We're going to do some stuff bilaterally, but then we're going to have to rally, the multilateral system to deal with some of China's unfair practices. And I agree with Wendy, even though I'm a Trump guy. I think we should have stayed in the TPP. And I think that's a plurilateral way that we can also isolate China. And I think it's an all of the above approach to deal with the problem with China.
So I want to pivot and give Wendy a chance. I know she's got thoughts on the China deal. I'm not sure she wants to go there now, but you know, we wanted to talk a little bit about, we had some different, certainly level of issues, but we had an idea of dealing for years with Japan on a lot of trade issues. Folks who are older might remember that Japan was China before China was China in the sense of our trade disputes, and they were the country that people were targeting as the ones taking advantage of the United States for many years. That's been a much more quiet, I think, trading relationship in the last couple decades. You negotiated with Japan as part of the team negotiating the TPP. That was a comprehensive trade agreement, but we ended up with a smaller agreement with Japan, a mini deal of some sorts. Do you want to talk about that and how we sort of ended up there, and what did we leave on the table by not going for a more comprehensive deal with Japan? There have been a lot of issues for many years that I know you and others have worked on.
Well, okay, let me get to that, but just 2 quick points. Clete conveniently forgot to talk about phase 2 of the China deal, because that was promised when phase 1 was announced. That, as he said, some of the issues weren't fully addressed, some weren't addressed at all, like industrial subsidies or state-owned enterprises. They were all on the list of issues to be negotiated in a phase 2 that hasn't started yet. And the point I just want to make is that's the danger of these phased negotiations. And one thing I found through my experience is that you're exhausted when you're done with phase 1. You're tired of your trading partner, and the notion you're going to go back to the table right away and get to all these tough issues, it's just kind of not human nature. So I put that on the table. The other thing I would just put forward as well, and I agree that, you know, what Clete said, that this administration is being, you know, quite pragmatic and, you know, looking at achieving trade results through mini deals. But he's not the first president to do this. In fact, when you think of Japan, and I think of my early negotiating days, they were all doing sectoral agreements with Japan. We did an agreement on semiconductors, an agreement on autos, a different agreement on supercomputers. So I think just in different stages during trade negotiating history, different approaches are favored or not favored. Getting to the question you asked then about Japan and this administration, people forget that when the president signed the executive order instructing his officials to withdraw from the TPP, he also put forward his preference for bilateral deals. And Japan just seemed like a prime target for a bilateral deal, but Japan resisted entering into bilateral negotiations, thinking that perhaps it could convince President Trump to return to TPP. And once that became clear, that wasn't going to happen. And once President Trump threatened the imposition of auto tariffs on Japan, in short, it felt like it had no choice but to enter into more limited negotiations with the United States. And at that point, for the United States, its main objective was to secure agriculture market access to the Japanese market that had been negotiated during TPP, that we left on the table, and that the other TPP countries were enjoying. And as a result, why do a comprehensive deal? Why not just, you know, force Japan, threaten them with auto tariffs, and get them to provide agriculture market access? And that was kind of the, you know, the genesis for that negotiation. Now, I'm sure Japan at the negotiating table quickly told the administration that that wasn't going to happen unless the US gave something in return. And as a result, the United States found some industrial tariff market access to give to Japan using existing trade authority, meaning it did not need to go to Congress for additional authority. And I know we're going to get into that whole question of the role of Congress. In addition, both sides basically agreed on the digital chapter with improvements of TPP. So in some ways, it was a strange mini deal. It was agriculture market access for the United States, limited industrial market access for the United States for Japan to our market, and then a digital deal. But again, there was talk of a phase 2 agreement to kind of address the rest of the issues and to make this deal WTO consistent. But once again, where is that phase 2? We haven't seen it. There are a number of US industries that I think feel that their interests were traded off by pursuing just a phase 1 deal. But again, China and Japan, we were promised second phases to negotiate other issues. Neither have started.
Well, let me ask you, Wendy, I mean, with China, it was never thought to be a we had a comprehensive list of grievances with China, but it wasn't thought to be a comprehensive bilateral trade negotiation in the sense that trade agreement with Japan was reached. But are we following WTO rules in reaching this mini deal with Japan? I mean, it doesn't, what you said, it doesn't seem to cover substantially all trade. And it also was it ever notified to Congress as a bilateral trade agreement? Did Congress have a consultative role or a role in approving the agreement the way, as many folks on this session know, the USMCA was just approved by Congress and had multiple layers and months and months and months of comprehensive discussions with Congress? Did any of that take place with the Japan deal, or did it sort of just get rolled out?
Well, the Trump administration, they did submit negotiating objectives to Congress. So they started that process. But in their notification, they did say that we may do this agreement in phases, but we will be consulting with Congress as we proceed. Congress, in response, and now they just say that was a deal where they felt there were very few consultations. They didn't know what was going on, and they were kind of surprised by the outcome. With respect to, to your WTO question, interestingly enough, this was a big issue for Japan, less important issue to this administration. What Japan was very concerned that it didn't meet the Article 24 requirements of substantially all trade. They told their diet that they were going to go back to the table to pursue a comprehensive deal. And they pointed to language in Article 24 of the GATT, which says you can do interim deals kind of on the way to kind of a deal that covers substantially all trade. But my sense is even in Japan, maybe folks have forgotten about, the WTO constraints.
Can I jump in here?
And I want to let's pivot a little bit to the role of Congress in this process.
Yeah.
And how these kinds of mini deals, and the colloquial term for it is how they don't need congressional approval. But go ahead, Clete.
I promise to pivot in just a second, but I did want to add, I think, what might be interesting and useful for folks, some color in the room. But let me start with just sort of, I want to make sure everyone understands, we're talking about comprehensive versus comprehensive. And what we're actually talking about here is that under WTO rules, in order to be an exception to the rule that you treat everyone the same, the general principle of the WTO is everyone should be treated the same. There's an exception to that. You can give them more favorable treatment in a trade agreement, but it has to cover substantially all trade. And so in order to meet that standard, generally you include everything you can think of, including tariffs. And so that's what we were aiming at. And there's also the question of what do you do under US law, under Trade Promotion Authority, under US law. Congress expects you to negotiate these things comprehensively. So with China, that was never really conceived. I mean, it was more the big list of grievances rather than some idea that we would take our most favored nation rates down with respect to China. We were never talking about giving them zero tariff treatment on a whole range of products. And so I have to say, though, with both those deals, I don't think phase 2 is ever going to happen for different reasons. Again, with China, it was the art of the possible. And it was the fact that the political climate had closed for something more comprehensive. And for Japan, I think both sides were kind of playing it cute, to be honest. And I was in New York when we agreed to the language setting out the negotiations. And Wendy's right. The whole time Japan didn't want to negotiate with the US on a bilateral deal because they were hoping for TPP. And I don't know, maybe it was a mistake tactically. I told him the truth is, your problem isn't the president. Your problem is Lighthizer and Navarro. the president's advisors who don't want to go back to TPP, there were multiple occasions when the president considered it and actually had my old boss, Gary Cohn, run a process, or at least try to start running a process to reconsider TPP. But Lighthizer really didn't want to do it because he thought that it had to be changed too much to meet some of the president's objectives on autos, for example. But so the real problem, again, was Lighthizer more than the president. But in any event, Japan finally realized that. They were scared of the auto tariffs, and we needed to come up with some solution. And Japan didn't want to commit to the US to do everything, because that would be giving up on their longstanding goal to get back to TPP. They had a problem with the diet. They had a problem with the WTO. We also had a problem with Congress. So we came up with phases. But I got to tell you, like, did any of us really think we were going to get to phase 2? We did what we had to do.
For a sec, because I'm just curious if did you just say something? I mean, we heard this line that the president dropped at one point a couple years ago. Well, maybe we could rejoin TPP at some point. Like, we heard that as a throwaway line. Am I hearing you that he actually meant it, and that was something that if there had not been this resistance from USTR and Navarro, that we might have actually had a chance to get back to it?
What I am saying to you is that he does not feel the same way about TPP that he feels about NAFTA.
Okay.
NAFTA, China joining the WTO, those are like swear words in the Oval Office. But he literally asked me point blank one time, what do you think about TPP? Did I make a mistake? I mean, I'm not in the Oval Office. And I sort of said, look, there are some problems with the agreement, but you should try to fix it like you did NAFTA. And he actually, at times, he asked the staff to look into that. Most prominently when he was in Davos in 2018, when he asked Cohn to run a process on that. And then, again, the problem that Lighthizer had was really that he felt like the auto provisions in particular would be very detrimental to the US auto industry, and that they needed to be completely revolutionized. It wouldn't be easy to do. And that if he allowed the president to go down that path, the president would be undermining his promises to restore the US auto industry.
So let's go back, and Wendy, I don't want to jump in. I mean, we're less than 5 weeks, or maybe 5 weeks from today, from the election. Trade's not front and center. Maybe it has a chance to reemerge as a political issue, but I'm not hearing much about it so far. Maybe we'll see what happens tonight. But, Wendy, you had to, when you were at USTR, you had to consult with Congress all the time. You were up there. That's where I first met you many years ago. That's one of the things about these comprehensive agreements is it involves a consultative process, brings in not just Congress, there's also advisory committees, and there's all sorts of outside groups that are able to have a chance to weigh in. There's a lot of transparency built into the process, especially now with the Trade Promotion Authority that the Congress has been operating under. When we go with these mini deals that sort of eliminate a lot of these consultative processes, are we losing an opportunity to build bigger constituencies for trade that may otherwise exist if there was a lot more people brought into the process?
Mm-hmm. And that's a great question. I mean, Trade Promotion Authority does provide very detailed guidance on the relationship between Congress and the executive branch during the negotiation. So it requires reports, it requires consultations, it requires, submission of objectives in the beginning, it references the advisory process, etc. What I found, though, is that even if you did other deals, it didn't mean then you have a green light not to consult with Congress. And most of the USTRs I work for felt very strongly that even if we weren't seeking a vote from Congress, we needed to keep them apprised of what we were doing. So probably when we first met, it wasn't under Trade Promotion Authority, Ken. It was probably me coming up and just briefing on progress and trying to open Japan's, let's just say, automotive market.
Exactly what it would have been.
Okay, it's a good guess, right?
Yeah.
So I'd make that point. But I think, the point you're making is that clearly that if you're doing a big comprehensive agreement, you need procedures for different interest groups. And here I don't just mean business, I mean labor, I mean civil society groups to weigh in and you need, a process for all of this. But the point I would just make is that one doesn't mean, it's not an either or proposition.
I forgot to pivot. Hi, Ken.
And I was going to also say compliments on I think on USMCA for sure. I think the Hill heard plenty on consultations, and there were a lot of civil society brought in, a lot of outside groups, and there was a huge amount of support for it, bipartisan, big numbers getting that agreement passed. So when you do have these kind of consultations, it can yield a very positive result.
It can, but let's just remember in TPP, we consulted all the time over, a 5-year period. And by the end, I think, a lot of stakeholders were more focused on not what we got for them, but what we didn't get for them. But that became the narrative.
Well, I want to get to TPP in a sec. Clete, you want to jump in real quick?
Well, no, I was just going to say I forgot to pivot and talk about Congress, but we got down another track. But no, I think this is an important point, and I think it's something that is going to need to be dealt with in the near term, and there may need to be some rethinking of the relationship, and how does, and when and how does Congress weigh in, and what are those procedures? Because I can tell you there were a lot of folks on the Hill who were very frustrated with the lack of transparency on some of these mini deals on Japan. They thought it was just kind of foisted upon them. And China as well. There wasn't much clarity to folks on the outside what was going on. Now, the administration would say there were reasons for that, but the bottom line is, I think, from Congress's standpoint, there needs to be more clarity and consultation about the objectives. From the administration standpoint, I think there needs to be a little bit of flexibility on how you actually get these things done, because the whole process of TPA, it's become quite cumbersome in some ways. All the reporting you have to do, the different deadlines and consulting. So I do think they need to rethink, is there a way that you keep Congress in the loop, you keep things comprehensive when you can, but that you're also a nod to reality and pragmatism, what is really necessary to make sure that there is bipartisan buy-in to these policies.
So just to clarify for our audience, those of you who don't know, TPA, Trade Promotion Authority, is legislation that Congress passes that gives the president the authority to negotiate trade agreements. Congress, by the virtue of the Constitution, has the power of regulating foreign commerce. So when the president's negotiating these comprehensive agreements, it's with the authority of Congress. That's Trade Promotion Authority. Used to be once known as Fast Track Authority, was changed, that name probably about 15 or 20 years ago. Wendy, thinking of these comprehensive agreements, and we've brought up TPP quite a bit actually on this session. You were one of the senior US negotiators of that negotiation, one of the biggest plurilateral trade agreements in history. The president pulled the United States out of it in 2017. You have a paper coming out tomorrow, I believe, talking about several paths forward for the United States to rejoin the TPP, which is now known as the Comprehensive and Progressive Trans-Pacific Partnership, that the other signatories to the TPP joined when the U.S. pulled out. Can you tell us what some of those paths might be for the U.S. to rejoin or join the CPTPP, and why you think it might be in America's interest to do that?
Sure. As you mentioned, tomorrow, the Asia Society Policy Institute, we will be publishing a report with kind of a roadmap for the next administration on re-engaging with TPP should the next administration decide whether it be a second term for Trump or Biden becomes the president. But one point I want to make is that we're not advocating we return to the TPP as negotiated 5 years ago. That agreement, in my view, is outdated. It doesn't really reflect the changes and developments in US trade policy and where the US public is, nor international developments. So if we were going to return, I think we would need to seek updates and revisions to the agreement. Now, that being said, as part of this report, I went out and I interviewed a number of current and former TPP officials from the TPP countries, just to kind of, take their temperature. Would they want us back, and what conditions, would they have in mind if we were to come back? And uniformly, what I heard was that the other countries, yes, they welcome us back, but they would hope that in coming back, we would be targeted and strategic with respect to changes to their agreement now that we would want to make. And so a big finding of our report is that if we're thinking of going back, the United States should consult widely domestically, figure out what we would really need in a revised TPP agreement. And in some ways, this sounds like the exercise that Trump asked Gary Cohn to conduct interagency. And that would take some time. And so the other recommendation we make is that in the meantime, and this gets back kind of to one of the themes of this webinar, is that we think of pursuing a narrower agreement with the CPTPP countries on a specific issue, whether it be digital, medical supply chains, trade and the environment / climate change, but as a means to kind of build trust, get us re-engaged, and allow us then to do our domestic homework, which would allow us then perhaps to return to the TPP. But I don't want to be, we're not being naive here. We're not being, Pollyannish. I think it's, it would be tough, but I think it's doable. And I would just conclude and say that I think the case for TPP is even more compelling now for the United States than it was 5 years ago, given, where we are with China and the fact that I think we've exhausted bilateral and unilateral tools. Second, I think in the aftermath of COVID, Asia is where it's happening in terms of economic growth and opportunity. And finally, a lot of people are talking about supply chains and developing trusted supply chains. Well, in TPP, you've got a ready, set group of like-minded countries that want to work with you and develop those secure supply chains. So I think there are a lot of reasons for doing so. And again, we're going to offer a roadmap of how we can find ourselves back there if indeed the next president chooses to do so.
And I don't know the number of there's 11 in TPP now without the US?
11 countries in TPP.
How many of those do we have, does the United States have bilateral agreements with already?
Well, I think we have 6 full bilateral agreements, and then the Japan deal, which is a mini deal.
Right. So in our discussion, we're going to wrap up soon and go to questions, I think, momentarily. But Clete, we've talked in this discussion about the structure of deals, the comprehensive, the multilateral, the plurilateral. We drilled down a little bit into the bilateral deals, and we drilled back up again to the plurilateral deals. You've written a paper, or you're working on one, I understand, on how to revitalize the WTO, which is where we get to the big agreements, multilateral agreements. Can you tell us maybe a little bit about what your thinking is on that? How are you seeing the United States kind of build trust, and use Wendy's words, build trust and re-engage at the WTO? Is that part of the plan, and where do you see that maybe potentially headed?
Well, look, I think this fits with some of the themes we've been talking about today. And when you think about China, I really think there's a 3-pronged approach. We did what we did in the phase 1 deal. I was a negotiator. I'm supportive of it. And I think it made a difference, but it didn't get far enough. So you need to supplement that. The second thing we've been talking a lot about here is TPP. And, again, I've been very clear on this. I think it is in the U.S. interest to get back into that agreement. I also don't want to leave anyone with the false impression, that it's going to be easy and that President Trump is open to this, next week. I mean, the reality is, as Lighthizer has articulated, there are some things that need to change. I think Wendy said the same thing. The autos is a problem for us. So it's not like we could even go that path tomorrow, but I think it's great that Wendy's doing a path to get back to that eventually over time. Now, my view is I've been trying to do the same thing on the WTO. And I really think that at the end of the day, we can talk about these bilateral approaches. We can talk about plurilaterals, which is a broader set, but you really need to have the globe come together and say some of the things that China is doing are unfair. They take advantage of the international system, and they need to change. And you need to do that in an organization where China is also a member, and so that these disciplines actually apply to them. I mean, the TPP, again, it's nice, but China's not in the TPP. They probably never will be. So I don't think it directly changes their behavior. The WTO is where everyone can come together and pressure China. And the focus of my paper I do a couple things. I mean, the first thing I say in the paper is the US and the EU really, as a starting point, need to figure out how to work together. Because if we can't work together, we're never going to solve these bigger problems. And then I outline what is intended to be comprehensive in terms of looking at the negotiation function, which hasn't produced a lot of results. How do we revitalize that? Look at monitoring and making sure countries are actually following through on their commitments, and then turning to dispute settlement. And I try to put forward something that, you know, maybe gets 80% of what Lighthizer wants, maybe 80% of what the Europeans want. Everyone's a little bit angry, but maybe we can find a way to work together. And that's my goal, is really to just start the conversation of how do the US and EU work together to fix the multilateral system so that it actually constrains China's worst behavior, along with some of the bilateral and plurilateral approaches that are necessary as well.
Great, thanks. So I think we're going to try to turn to audience questions now and see if Jill's going to come back online. There she is. Hi, Jill.
Hi, Ken. Thank you all for this discussion. We've got some good questions rolling in right now as I speak. I want to mention just one thing on the US-China Phase 1 deal, since earlier in the conversation you were talking about, there was a question about purchases and about the structural commitments that China made to, as part of that deal, to improve market access. We do have a podcast at the Yater Institute called Trade Matters, where we just released an episode a couple of weeks ago that listeners might be interested in, where we focused on the structural aspects of that deal, particularly when it comes to agriculture. So I wanted to note that as well. Coming back to the TPP though, you know, the TPP was really sold as a strategic imperative at the time that it was being negotiated, well before the Trump administration, you know, withdrew from the deal. And so I've got a question here that relates to that. And that question is, if plurilaterals, assuming the TPP here in this question, that exclude China, do not constrain it, then what is achieved on US-China issues by isolating China through plurilaterals? And I'm implying here that this question may be referring to the TPP. They're referring to plurilaterals there. But again, given that this deal was sold as, you know, part of the pivot to Asia, for example, or rebalance, and not just on its economic gains purely, how could it constrain China is the question if China's not part of it and isn't constrained by the deal itself. So Wendy, maybe do you want to start on that one?
Yeah, so the thinking behind the TPP, it wasn't to constrain China. And this is what China said initially, right? Like the whole purpose of TPP is to contain us, I think was the word they used. It was more to work with other like-minded countries to improve and update and strengthen the international trading rules, recognizing that the WTO negotiating function was paralyzed. And by creating higher standards and in areas, in new areas like state-owned enterprises and other areas, the idea was to kind of provide an alternative economic model to that state-led model that China was and is kind of pushing in the region. And the notion was, and this is why it was so important, that it wasn't going to be a closed agreement, that over time, the hope was other countries in the region would join, and then that would kind of compel or you know, make China rethink its policies and maybe then, you know, change and try and move closer to the TPP rules. And just one anecdote, right when I left USTR and I left the week that TPP was concluded, that was my last day, I had made a promise to then USTR Michael Froman that I would stay until the end of the TPP negotiations. I think it's similar to Clete's promise to his wife. I thought at that time it'd be a 6-month commitment. It was really more like a 2-year commitment. But in any event, I did leave then. And one of the first trips I took was to Beijing. And when I got there, everyone I met with, including government and non-government people, they all had a million questions for me on TPP. And they weren't like very general questions. They were like, in the state-owned enterprise chapter, you have an annex that allows Vietnam to do X, Y, and Z. Could we do something like that? And it really demonstrated to me that they were really thinking about it and looking at these rules as possible rules, that they should take seriously. And second, I would say is that when we concluded TPP, I think there were like 7 or 8 other countries, particularly in Southeast Asia, but including Southeast Asia, some in Latin America and others, that expressed interest in joining the TPP. So there was a lot of momentum there. And so, none of this ever panned out. But there was a moment in time that even though China wasn't a member, it looked like things were coming together. And obviously it was a very kind of short-lived moment, but a moment I enjoyed experiencing.
Yeah, and I just want to add to that. I mean, I think I agree with everything Wendy said, but what I would say is another way to think about it is building blocks for multilateralism. And, you look at like NAFTA, for example, way back in the day, was the building block for a lot of the WTO agreements. We basically negotiated NAFTA and we took a lot of that and we imported it into the WTO. And I think the idea here would be, if you get enough countries to agree to these principles in a plurilateral context, it makes it that much easier to then import them into the WTO, where ultimately, if you got agreement there, they would apply to China there. So even though I can't quite envision a scenario where China would ever join the TPP, maybe you could pressure them to adopt some of the policies by importing some of the TPP into the WTO.
Okay, thank you. So switching gears just a little bit here, here's another question that's come in, which is, today China and Asian countries dominate US trade discussions. Do you foresee that being the case 5 years from now? Or will we look to other regions, for example, Africa or Latin America? Now, maybe you want to comment on the US-Kenya negotiation, or perhaps the talks with Brazil that are going on as well, along with that question too.
Maybe I'll start this one since Wendy started the last one. I mean, I think China and getting China right, dealing with the threat posed by China's economic model is going to be sort of the question of our generation. And it's the existential problem. How do you fit this non-market system into a system that was built by market economies for market economies? And it's not easy. And, I think that's going to be the problem facing us for the foreseeable future. And that doesn't mean Latin America is not important, Africa is not important, the rest of Asia is not important. They all are. And I do think that we need to make, and Europe, and we need to make sure that they are part of our strategy. And I really do think that the only way that we actually will successfully promote our model over China's model is to get them to come along and to build that coalition globally. And so again, I think China will be the major issue for all of our, there's probably maybe some young people on here, but for most of our lifetimes, I do think that's going to be the big issue. And when I think about the other countries, I do think about how do we get them into our system and our way of life, as opposed to the alternative, which I think is a scary one, quite frankly. So I guess the answer is yes, it is going to be the dominating issue.
And I could agree more, and I would just point out, it's not just like our market access to China. China's unfair practices are, they've trade distorting global effects, which are going to affect us and other countries as they sell to third countries as well. And so, yes, this is the issue. In fact, I'd go a little further here and just say, particularly when it comes to Japan and the EU now, I mean, my view is, why spend our time trying to negotiate comprehensive bilateral FTAs, whether called TTIP or whatever, with either of those countries? I think the time would be more well spent trying to just work through those bilateral irritants, but then really working together, putting a lot of weight on working on the China issues, on WTO reform, but more the global and third country issues, versus getting bogged down in, very long, acrimonious bilateral negotiations when, for example, Europe doesn't want to open their agriculture market, or Japan, doesn't want to open its services market. Try and deal in a targeted way with those market access concerns, but spend your time with these countries really trying to deal with these third country, not just China issues, but WTO reform and other areas where we have common interests.
I agree 100%. And I was actually talking to a European, someone with the commission the other day, and we were saying, what do we need to do? Fix the WTO, work together on China, And then I threw in, you got to stop taxing our tech companies. But that's another.
We're going to have bilateral irritants with Europe and with Japan, but that doesn't mean that we need to have bilateral comprehensive negotiations, because just by definition, they will become acrimonious and they're going to take a lot of time and a lot of resources.
Right, I agree.
So along those lines, just picking up on that point, the US does have negotiations, as you know, underway with the UK, with Kenya, that are, at least for now, comprehensive. Do you see those turning into mini deals over time as that goes on?
For the UK, I don't. And this has been, a lot of people have been asking, are they going to cut some deal before the election? And everything I've heard from USTR has been absolutely not. They want to do it comprehensive. I think it's important to do it comprehensively because it really set the stage for sort of, how do they engage with Europe more broadly over time. So it's really important, I think, for them to have a model there with the UK. And so I don't think there's a high likelihood of that. I will say one comment here is I really do hope that no matter who does win the election, they keep pushing forward on those UK negotiations. I know Vice President Biden has said he wants to focus on domestic issues first, but I do hope he would keep going with that one because I think it is progressing pretty well. And so even though it won't be wrapped up by January, I hope he'll prioritize that if he does become president.
Okay, we have time for probably about one more question here, and this has to do with TPP again and auto rules of origin. So the question is, how will the auto rule of origin issue be resolved if the US re-engages with TPP? So the USMCA auto rules of origin are much more stringent than in TPP, so it would be difficult to bring TPP into alignment with that. So is the answer Wendy's earlier suggestion by starting with non-comprehensive talks with CPTPP countries? And also as an add-on here, will auto rules of origin also be as big an issue if there were to be a Biden administration?
Well, as someone who negotiated auto rules of origin and TPP, those were some of the most difficult negotiations I ever participated in, with really Japan as the major adversary, but also frankly, Canada and Mexico. And I think that if we were to go to the TPP countries and put on the table the USMCA outcomes on auto rules of origin, I think it would be a really difficult slog. That said, these are one of the issues we're going to need to kind of work through. As you recall, with with Canada and Mexico, we have zero tariffs. So the rule of origin is really important with respect to automotive trade. With Japan in TPP, we had gotten them to agree to accept us not lowering our 25% truck tariff for 30 years and our automotive tariff for 25 years. So I think you also need to take into consideration that we were never talking about zero tariffs on autos with Japan, even though it was in a comprehensive agreement. But without getting into all the details, I think what Clete said earlier is right. This would be a really difficult issue. But I would also say, for example, there are other issues that were really difficult in TPP 5 years ago that might not be quite as difficult now. But just because an issue is difficult, it doesn't mean that that should prevent you from, trying to, just explore the possibility of being able to find some kind of common ground. The other point I would make on rules of origin is that as more countries if more countries accede to TPP, for example, if Thailand were to accede to the TPP, Japan and Thailand have very integrated commercial relationship in the automotive sector. I think the automotive rule of origin could become, less of a problem for Japan.
Yeah, I just want to comment on that too, because again, I think, Lighthizer was correct in telling the president that based on the objectives the president gave him, in USMCA and in changing the nature of the auto industry, TPP as it existed wouldn't work. And so I don't know, and Wendy was the negotiator, and I believe her when she says, we probably couldn't have moved it much more. And so if that really is the case, I wonder whether, you do just set it aside for now and say, look, that is the one issue that I think above all else was problematic for the United States, and that is problematic for this administration. And maybe without that, you can find a way to move forward. Now that's not your ideal solution. But again, I'm going back to my theme of like, can we be pragmatic about it and say there's a lot of good to harvest there? Let's not leave that on the cutting room floor. And if jettisoning the auto provisions is what you need to do, maybe that is what we need to do. Wendy also makes the point that, we do need to update it because that was negotiated now 5, 6, 7 years ago. But that is, and I won't get into the details of it, but again, the argument that Lighthizer made that I think is correct is that if you did adopt the TPP rules of origin, you wouldn't move the auto industry in the direction that the president wants to do and that he is doing through USMCA, and that's a fundamental problem that would need to be fixed.
Thank you all. We are out of time, but I want to thank Ken and Wendy and Clete very much for sharing your time and insights with us. This has been a really informative session. I'm sure we'll have more questions for you in the months to come. Thanks again to the CAB Group Foundation for its support, as well as the Yider Institute team for their collaboration. That's John Began, Matt Schaefer, Ed Balistreri, and JC Toman. Our next webinar is next Tuesday, October 6th, on the topic of managing risk in agricultural trade. Thanks again, everyone, and have a wonderful rest of your day.
Thank you.
Thank you.